1920 Superior. Ice skin on black water, fog rolling off the harbor, wind cutting through wool and skin alike. A rope loop with no visible ends rests frozen beneath the lantern housing. Footprints stop at the rail and do not continue. If the boy never returned by dawn, who wrote the delivery entry in his hand, dated tomorrow? The harbor froze early that year. November brought a blizzard that sealed Lake Superior under 3 feet of ice and laid a crust along the Lightwalk that stretched 200 yards from shore to the beacon. The structure was simple timber and iron, built in 1892 to guide ore boats through the Narrows. 2 rails ran its length. Between them, weathered planks sagged under snow and wind. The keeper maintained the lantern, a rotating Fresnel lens powered by lamp oil hauled in tin cans twice a week. The Orphan was 12. Records at St. Mary's listed him as quiet, careful with his letters, prone to walking the docks alone. The sisters sent him out on the afternoon of November 18th with 2 cans of oil and a note for the keeper. The wind was rising, but the sky held light. He wore a gray coat, wool cap, boots with iron cleats for the ice. A lunch pail hung from his belt. The walk to the beacon took 15 minutes in good weather. By 4 o'clock, the blizzard had closed the harbor like a fist. The keeper waited inside the lantern room. He heard no knock. By 5, the light was burning on the last of the old oil. He lit a hand lantern and opened the iron door. Snow hissed against the glass. He saw nothing on the catwalk, no shape moving through the white. He called once, heard only wind. He closed the door and returned to the lens. The beam turned, slow and precise, cutting through the storm in measured sweeps. At dawn, the wind stopped. The keeper descended the spiral stair and stepped onto the catwalk. Snow lay smooth and unbroken along the rails. No footprints led to the door. He walked the length of the structure, boots crunching, breath fogging in the cold. Near the midpoint, he found a single shoe print pressed into the frost that coated the rail cap. The print was small, a child's boot with cleats. It faced the water. Around it, frost had formed in concentric rings 5 or 6 layers thick, as if the ice had grown outward from the mark itself. He touched it. The frost did not melt under his glove. 20 feet farther, he found the rope. It lay beneath the housing where the catwalk widened into a maintenance platform. The rope was frozen into the ice, sealed flat like a pressed flower. He knelt and traced it with his finger. The loop was complete, unbroken, with no splice, no knot, no visible join. He chipped at the ice with his knife. The rope came free in his hand, stiff and cold. He turned it over. The fibers were hemp, 3-strand twist, standard dock line. The ends were not there. He ran his thumb along the circumference. Seamless. He returned to the lantern room and checked the delivery ledger. The last entry was dated November 17th, his own hand, noting low oil reserves. Below it, a new line. The ink was fresh, the letters precise and careful, the script he recognized from notes the boy had brought before. It read, "Oil delivered, 2 cans, 4:15 p.m., November 19th. The keeper looked at the calendar nailed to the wall. The date was November 19th. The entry was written for today. He read it again. The ink had not dried. He searched the platform, the stair, the cramped storage room beneath the lens. He found no oil cans. He found no coat, no cap, no second boot. The lunch pail was not there. He lit a cigarette and smoked it standing at the rail. The ice stretched unbroken to the shore. Smoke rose straight in the still air. He finished the cigarette and flicked the stub into the water below. It hissed against the ice and went dark. Word reached St. Mary's by noon. The sisters sent 2 men with poles to probe the ice along the Lightwalk. They worked in silence, driving the poles down through the crust, listening for the dull thud of wood or the softer resistance of cloth. The ice answered with hollow knocks that traveled farther than they should. One man swore he felt the pole strike something solid at 8 feet, but when he withdrew it, the tip was clean. They moved along the catwalk, marking each probe with a chalk X on the rail. By evening, their hands were numb, and their marks covered half the length of the structure. They found nothing. The sheriff arrived the next morning with a deputy and a man who kept dogs. The dogs circled the base of the Lightwalk, noses low, tails stiff. They did not bark. They did not pull toward the ice. After 20 minutes, they lay down in the snow and refused to move. The handler tried coaxing them with meat. They turned their heads away. He kicked snow at them. They closed their eyes. He gave up and led them back to the truck. The sheriff walked the catwalk with the keeper. They examined the shoe print. The frost rings had not melted despite 2 days of sun. The sheriff touched the rail with his bare hand and pulled it back quickly. He said nothing. They walked to the maintenance platform and looked at the place where the rope had been. The keeper showed him the loop, now coiled on a shelf in the lantern room. The sheriff held it up to the light, turned it over, tugged at the circumference. He set it down without comment. They returned to shore and the sheriff opened his notebook. He asked about the boy. The keeper said he had seen him 4 times before, always alone, always punctual, always with the same careful gait. The boy never spoke beyond a greeting. He delivered the oil, waited for the keeper to sign the receipt and walked back. The sheriff asked if the boy had seemed afraid. The keeper said no. He asked if the boy had mentioned anyone following him. The keeper said the boy never mentioned anything. The sheriff closed the notebook. He said he would speak to the sisters. At St. Mary's, the sheriff sat in the parlor with Sister Agnes. She brought tea and a folder of records. The boy had come to them in 1915, she said, after his mother died of influenza. No father listed, no kin. He was good with numbers, good with his letters, prone to staring at maps and tracing routes along the lakeshore with his finger. He walked the docks after lessons. He watched the oar boats and the tugs. He never caused trouble. Sister Agnes paused. She said the boy had asked her once if ice could hold a person down. She had told him it could, if the person went under. He had nodded and walked away. The sheriff asked if the boy had seemed troubled. Sister Agnes said no more than any boy without a family. She asked if they had found a body. The sheriff said no. She asked if they would keep looking. He said they would probe again when the weather cleared. She thanked him. He left the folder on the table and walked out into the cold. That night the beacon turned as it always had, slow and steady, cutting arcs across the frozen harbor. At midnight the keeper sat at his desk and marked the log. The light was holding. The oil was sufficient. The weather was clear. He set down his pen and listened. The lantern hummed, a low mechanical drone that never changed. Beneath it, another sound. A faint pulse, rhythmic and soft, like a second heartbeat under the first. He stood and walked to the lens. The beam passed over the ice, returned, passed again. He counted the rotations, 30 seconds per sweep, 2 per minute, standard interval. He listened. The pulse was still there, arriving just after the beam completed its arc, a soft extra beat that only counted for those who stopped to breathe and listen. He descended the stair and stepped onto the catwalk. The stars were bright, and the air was still. He walked to the center of the structure and stood at the rail. The ice below was smooth, unbroken, luminous under the moon. He heard the pulse again, faint but clear, rising from somewhere beneath the boards. He knelt and pressed his ear to the planks. The sound was hollow, distant like knocking from the other side of a closed door. He stood and returned to the lantern room. He did not mark the sound in the log. At dawn, a volunteer found the lunch pail. It sat on the catwalk near the maintenance platform, lid closed, handle upright. The volunteer called to the others. They gathered around it. The pail was tin, dented at the base, marked with initials scratched into the metal. No snow covered the lid. No frost coated the handle. The volunteer lifted it. Inside, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, an apple, a folded napkin. The sandwich was fresh. The bread was soft. The apple had no bruises. The volunteer set the pail down and stepped back. One of the men opened the napkin. It was embroidered with a small cross in blue thread, the kind the sisters used at St. Mary's. The stitching was clean. The fabric smelled faintly of soap. The sheriff returned and examined the pail. He asked the volunteer where he had found it. The man pointed to the spot on the catwalk. The sheriff asked if anyone had touched it before he arrived. The volunteer said only to lift the lid. The sheriff asked if the pail had been there the day before. The volunteer said no. They had walked the catwalk twice. The pail had not been there. The sheriff looked at the keeper. The keeper shook his head. He had checked the catwalk at dusk. The catwalk had been empty. The sheriff carried the pail to shore and placed it in the back of his truck. He drove to St. Mary's and showed it to Sister Agnes. She identified the initials. She identified the napkin. She asked where it had been found. The sheriff told her. She sat down slowly. She said the boy had packed the pail himself the morning he left. She had watched him wrap the sandwich, fold the napkin, close the lid. He had carried it with him when he walked out the door. She asked how it could have appeared 2 days later with no snow on the lid. The sheriff said he did not know. Volunteers returned to the ice with saws and axes. They cut test holes at intervals along the Lightwalk, working in pairs, breathing hard in the cold. The first hole went down 6 feet and struck water. The second went 8 and found nothing. The third, directly beneath the maintenance platform, went 12 feet before the saw blade caught on something solid. They widened the hole and one man lowered himself on a rope, lantern in hand. He descended into darkness, boots scraping ice, breath clouding around the flame. At 10 feet he stopped. He called up that he saw wood. They lowered him farther. At 12 feet he reached a horizontal surface, smooth and flat like a submerged deck. He touched it with his glove. The wood was dry. He moved the lantern across the surface. No water, no ice, only planks fitted tight with no gaps. He called up again. They pulled him to the surface. He sat on the ice and said nothing for a long time. When he spoke, he said the wood should not be there. There was no structure beneath the Lightwalk, no platform, no foundation that deep. The others asked what he meant. He said he meant the wood was impossible. They sealed the hole and did not cut another. The sheriff returned to his office and reviewed the maps. The harbor charts showed bedrock at 18 feet, silt and clay above that, open water in summer, ice in winter. No submerged structures, no sunken docks. He called the harbor master and asked about wrecks. The harbor master said there were no wrecks within a mile of the Lightwalk. He said the last boat to go down in the Narrows was in 1902, a schooner that burned and sank in 40 feet of water half a mile east. The sheriff asked if there were tunnels. The harbor master laughed and said there were no tunnels. The bedrock was solid. The sheriff thanked him and hung up. People in town began to talk. The boy had gone through the ice, some said. Boys did that. The ice looked solid, but underneath were currents, weak spots, places where the cold did not reach. Others said the boy had run. He had no family, no future at the orphanage. He had walked to the beacon and kept walking, across the ice to the far shore, to Michigan or beyond. A few said the boy had been taken. There were men who worked the docks, who drank and gambled and looked for easy prey. The boy had been small, alone, carrying nothing of value except his time. The keeper heard the theories and said nothing. He knew the ice. He knew the currents. The ice had been solid that night, 3 feet thick, wind-packed and hard. A boy could not fall through without breaking the surface, without leaving a crack, a dark stain, some mark of passage. He knew the distance. The far shore was 6 miles across open water. No boy could walk that in a blizzard in the dark without a light or a compass. And the pail. The pail had been fresh, the bread soft, the apple unmarked. The pail had appeared after 2 days with no snow on the lid, as if set there from a warmer hour, from a place where wind and cold did not reach. He thought of the rope, the loop with no ends. He had hung it on a peg in the lantern room and checked it each day. The hemp was sound, the fibers tight, the circumference unbroken. He had shown it to a sailor who worked the tugs. The sailor had turned it over, pulled at it, held it to the light. He had given it back without a word. Later he had told the keeper that a rope like that could not be made. A splice that perfect did not exist. The sailor had said he had been working lines for 30 years and he had never seen a join that clean. The keeper had asked what it meant. The sailor had shrugged and said it meant someone was playing tricks, or it meant the rope had always been a loop, sealed at the ends before the fibers were spun. The keeper had asked how that was possible. The sailor had said it was not. In December, the temperature dropped and the ice thickened. The search stopped. Volunteers marked the calendar for spring. The sheriff closed the case and filed the report. He listed the boy as missing, presumed drowned, body unrecovered. He noted the shoe print, the rope, the pail, the submerged wood. He noted the inconsistencies and the lack of evidence. He wrote that the case remained open pending new information. He signed the report and placed it in a drawer. He did not speak of it again. The keeper maintained the light. He filled the reservoir, cleaned the lens, marked the log each night. The beacon turned and the pulse continued, faint and steady, arriving after each sweep like an echo that had lost its source. He listened for it and it was there. He ignored it and it persisted. In January, he wrote to the lighthouse service and requested a transfer. He gave no reason. The service replied in February and said there were no positions available until spring. He stayed. On the night of February 10th, the keeper woke to a sound outside. He rose and lit a lantern and opened the door. The catwalk was empty. The ice below was dark and still. He walked to the maintenance platform and looked down. The hole they had cut in December was frozen over, covered in fresh snow. He stood at the rail and listened. The sound came again, a low metallic hum, like a wire drawn tight and plucked. He turned and saw the rope. It hung from the housing beam where he had left it weeks before, moved from the lantern room for no reason he could recall. The loop swayed slightly in the still air, turning in a slow circle. He reached for it. The hemp was warm. He pulled his hand back. The rope stopped moving. He touched it again. Warm, almost hot, as if heated from within. He lifted it off the peg. The weight was wrong. The loop felt heavier than before, denser, as if the fibers had compressed or the core had filled with something he could not see. He held it to the lantern light. The hemp was unchanged. The weave was tight. The circumference was seamless. He set it on the platform and stepped back. The rope lay flat, unmoving. He returned to the lantern room and did not sleep. At dawn, he descended and examined the rope in daylight. It was cold again, ordinary, a loop of hemp with no ends. He coiled it and returned it to the peg. He marked the log and noted nothing unusual. That afternoon, a boy from town brought a telegram. The message was from St. Mary's. It read, "Received letter today from boy. Stop claims he is safe. Stop letter, dated November 19th. Stop, no postmark, stop. Sister Agnes." The keeper read it twice. He asked the boy when the telegram had been sent. The boy said that morning. The keeper gave him a coin and sent him away. He sat at his desk and looked at the calendar. February 10th. The letter had arrived nearly 3 months after the boy disappeared. He walked to shore and drove to St. Mary's. Sister Agnes met him in the parlor. She handed him the envelope. It was addressed to her in careful script, the same hand that had written the delivery entry in the ledger. The paper was clean, uncreased. The envelope bore no postmark, no stamp, no mark of passage through the mail. Inside, a single page. The letter read, "I am safe. I delivered the oil. I am where the light reaches. Please do not look for me." The signature was the boy's name, written in ink that had not faded. Sister Agnes asked what it meant. The keeper said he did not know. She asked if he believed the letter was real. He said the handwriting was real, the ink was real, the paper was real. Where it had come from, how it had arrived, he could not say. Sister Agnes folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. She said she would keep it. She asked if he would continue looking. He said there was nothing left to look for. She nodded. He left. March brought warmer air and the first cracks in the ice. By April, the harbor was open water again, dark and cold, lapping against the pilings. The keeper watched for debris, for cloth, for anything rising to the surface. The water gave up nothing. In May, a crew inspected the Lightwalk and found the plank sound, the rails intact, the structure undamaged by the winter freeze. They found no trace of the boy, no boot, no coat, no second shoe. They cut away the section of rail where the frost rings had been. The wood was unmarked. The rings had vanished with the thaw. In June, the ice gave up the rope. A fisherman found it tangled in his net 100 yards offshore. He brought it to the keeper. The loop was unchanged, seamless, intact. The keeper asked where he had found it. The fisherman pointed to open water, deep water, a place where the ice should have taken it down and held it fast. The keeper took the rope and hung it in the lantern room. It hung there through the summer, through the fall, into the next winter. It never frayed. It never aged. The keeper touched it sometimes, and it was always cold. In September, the lighthouse service reassigned him. A new keeper arrived, and the old keeper packed his belongings. He left the rope on the peg. The new keeper asked what it was. The old keeper said it was a loop with no ends. The new keeper asked what that meant. The old keeper said it meant someone had been there and someone had left, and the space between was still open. The new keeper did not understand. The old keeper did not explain. The ledger remained in the lantern room, locked in a cabinet with the other logs. The entry dated November 19th stayed in the book, ink fresh, letters precise, written in the hand of a boy who had walked out onto the ice and not returned. The keeper who came after found it one winter night and read it by lantern light. He checked the calendar. He checked the date. He marked the page with a ribbon and closed the book. He never opened it again. The beacon still turns. The light still reaches across the water, slow and steady, cutting arcs through the dark. At midnight, if the air is still and the harbor is quiet, a faint pulse follows each sweep, soft and rhythmic, like a second heartbeat under the first. Fishermen hear it sometimes and say nothing. Sailors feel it in their chest and change course. The ice comes and goes. The Lightwalk holds. And somewhere beneath the boards, in a place where the cold does not reach, a lunch pail sits with no snow on its lid, waiting for a hand that will not return. If the boy wrote the letter after he disappeared, where was he writing from? And what light was he talking about? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.